And good afternoon, Riverdale. My name is Evan Weiner, and I want to thank Vicky for inviting me to speak before you. This talk is all about 1964, and before I go on, I'll give a little background on myself. I was 7 and 8 years old in 1964, and I did watch the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and I did go to the World's Fair over in Flushing Meadows Park, and I was your typical kid growing up in New York City. My background is radio and TV. In 1971, I got on radio, WRKL radio in Mount Ivy, New York, Rockland County. I did a show called Tiger Talk with a few others from Spring Valley High School. And Joe Dionisio opened the door for me, and I also was able to work with the Bergen Record and the Nyack Journal News. In 1978, I joined WNEW Radio as a news stringer, and among the stories that I covered for WNEW, my scoop, John Lindsay running for Senate in the state of New York in 1980, that happened in 1978. I also interviewed Ronald Reagan for WNEW, as well as covering the returning hostages from Iran in January of 1981. 1964, 56 years ago. A lot happened in 1964. It was the first year that the baby boomers became adults. The baby boomers turned 18. The first baby boomers turned 18 in 1964. I'll give you 3 examples of baby boomers who became of age in 1964. And if this works, here we go. They will be Donald Trump, born in 1946. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, also born in 1946. And Bill Clinton, also born in 1946. 3 of the most prominent baby boomers in the United States. The Civil Rights Act was passed in July of 1964. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, provided or prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements, and racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. One area that the civil rights movement did not touch was women's rights in education. Women could not or could be bounced from a school or not allowed into a school for no particular reason. They did not have equal rights in education. That would come 8 years later. And there is Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act into law. Behind him, Martin Luther King, and a couple rows back, the tall, good-looking guy. Oh, I owe a lot of my news career to him, John Lindsay, because he gave me the scoop in 1978 in Nyack, New York, that he was running for Senate in New York. And that's how I got on WNEW, because Lindsay told me that. They called me up, can we have the story? And I got $10 for the story, and I was on WNEW radio for 3.5 years. August 7th, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that authorized President Lyndon Johnson to take any measures he believed were necessary to retaliate and promote the maintenance of international peace and security in Southeast Asia. And there is Johnson roughly around that time, August 7th, 1964. It was also a summer of rioting. Harlem, Philadelphia, Chicago, Jersey City, and other places throughout the United States. That is the Bronx, rather that is Harlem, around 125th Street and Lenox Avenue during the rioting in Harlem. And that is Rochester, New York, where a demonstrator is bleeding from the side of his head during one of the demonstrations / resurrection / rioting in 1964 in Rochester. These guys came over, and Paul McCartney is still putting out albums. His next album is coming out on December 11th, called McCartney 3. Of course, the Beatles and Beatlemania takes root in America. That is Cassius Clay, or at that point, Muhammad X, taking on Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship of the world. The Beatles, Ali, worlds collide. Kind of sets the tone of the 1960s. Fidel Castro is there, as Howard Cosell once called him, El Comandante. He is still a thorn in the United States. This is him trying to play baseball in 1964. We have here Nikita Khrushchev, who will very shortly after this picture with a head no longer be the head of the Soviet Union. Cyprus independence from British rule, 1960. There was some rising tensions between that island's Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriot communities. And by 1964, there were clashes between rival paramilitary factions. And there is what is going on in Cyprus. The World's Fair opened up 1964, and some of the World's Fair still exists. Not necessarily in Flushing Meadow Park. There are some remnants like the Unisphere, but some of it sits in Disney World right now, and some of it sits in Disneyland. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation in public places, or we're supposed to end segregation in public places, banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And again, there is Lyndon Johnson handing one of the pens to Martin Luther King when the landmark legislation was signed into law. Now, if you go back at that point about 99 years, following the Civil War, there was a trio of constitutional amendments that abolished slavery, made former slave citizens, and gave all men, notice it's all men, it's not everybody, it's all men. Women could not vote. All men got the right to vote regardless of race following the Civil War. Women didn't. And this is just a picture of people mulling around, deciding what to do with Reconstruction and civil rights, an illustration in one of the magazines in the late 1860s, early 1870s. And poll taxes, that was one of the things they talked about, how particularly in the South, that the former slaves should pay a poll tax. There was literacy taxes and other measures to keep African-American citizens disenfranchised. The Jim Crow laws, it wasn't really an official Jim Crow law, but politicians and local people enforced strict segregation through Jim Crow laws and condoned violence from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which came up after the Civil War. And there is the poll tax. White men, hey, go ahead and vote. Black men, well, you got to pay to vote. Stovetop hat. The 1875 Civil Rights Act is notable. It's the last major piece of legislation related to Reconstruction that was passed by Congress during the Reconstruction era, which roughly lasted 1865 to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, or actually the election of Samuel Tilden, but some deals were cut. The acts included the Civil Rights Act of 1866, 4 Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 1868, 3 more in 1870 and 71, and 3 constitutional amendments between 1865 and 1870. As Ulysses S. Grant, he becomes president after Andrew Johnson, and he inherits the role of getting the country united. The Compromise of 1877. Grant is done, and the Democratic candidate is Samuel Tilden. The Republican candidate in the election of 1876 is Rutherford B. Hayes. There is a question as to who wins the election. The deal is cut. The Democrats say to Tilden, we'll see you later. We don't need you anymore. We will allow Rutherford B. Hayes to become president. But you Democrats in the South, you get, under Hayes, the Republican, you get troops withdrawn, federal troops withdrawn from the South, and you get home rule. It's a deal both parties made. Hayes did keep the bargain. He withdrew federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina, and that marked a major turning point in American political history that ended the Reconstruction era and started Jim Crow and segregation in the South. And there is Rutherford B. Hayes. The Compromise of 1876 ended the Reconstruction era. The Southern Democrats' promises to protect the civil and political rights of blacks were not kept, and the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disenfranchisement of black voters. Money to vote? Not long ago, not very long ago, in our lifetimes, in 1964. Some states still required people to pay to vote in the national election. It was called the poll tax. On January 23rd, 1964, the United States ratified the 24th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which prohibited any poll tax in elections for federal officials. The death knell to the civil rights cases that were, or actually the amendments, came in 1883. The Supreme Court ruled in civil rights cases that the public accommodation sections of the Civil Rights Acts were unconstitutional. They said that Congress was not afforded control over private persons or corporations under the Equal Protection Clause. And it would be the last 17 years of the 19th century and the first 64 years, which is 81 years in total, that would be the case. This is down in Mobile, Alabama, at a museum in Mobile, Alabama, colored entrance only. And here is a guy drinking water from the colored water fountain. That was for men and women, and there was a white water fountain for men and women because they did not want to mix the races in the South. The demonstrations start in the 1950s, the presence of segregation and the absence of democracy. Jim Crow must go. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, a landmark 1954 Supreme Court case. The justices ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. But hey, you know what? There were places in the South that did not obey the Supreme Court, including Little Rock, Arkansas. On September 4th, 1957, the first day of classes at Central High, Arkansas, Governor Orval Farbus called in the Arkansas National Guard to block every black student's entry into the high school. Later that month, Dwight Eisenhower, who wasn't doing very much in terms of the civil rights movement, he was sitting on his hands, sent federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine into the school. That is the first real television attention given to the civil rights movement. And there is Eisenhower speaking to a number of people in the Oval Office. Civil Rights Act of 1957. Protection of voter rights set out in the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice empowering federal prosecutors to obtain court injunction against interference with the right to vote. Civil Rights Commission within the executive branch with the authority to investigate discriminatory conditions and to recommend corrective measures. The purpose of that bill was to increase the number of registered black voters in the South. Only 20% were registered in the South as total, and there were lower numbers in communities in the Deep South, talking about Mississippi and Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana. And there is Eisenhower signing a bill into law. This all included federal inspection of local voter registration polls by appointed referees to oversee Southern elections and ensure that African Americans were permitted to vote. Penalties for anyone who obstructed someone's attempt to register to vote or vote. It extended the life of the Civil Rights Commission, which was previously limited to 2 years. The commission would oversee voter registration and practices, prosecution for interfering with court orders regarding school desegregation. John Kennedy is elected president in 1960. takes office January 20th, 1961, and sits on his hands for more than 2 years, except for a case here or there. He gets upset when he sees the cover of the New York Times, May of 1963, of what is going on in Birmingham, Alabama. There are protests in Birmingham, and those protests are met with heavy resistance from the police. It was also the first time that television went to the South to cover a demonstration. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy decided to give a talk, finally, after nearly 2.5 years in office. JFK sought legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, similar establishments, as well as greater protection for the right to vote. Kennedy was moved because he saw pictures in the newspaper, and he also saw it played out on TV, so he had to do something. But he really didn't do anything. He let it go and let it go and let it go. And of course, he was assassinated November 22nd, 1963, so it was up to Johnson to carry the ball, and he did. Why he did? That's a good question, but he did. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 barred unequal application of voter registration requirements, outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in motels, restaurants, theaters, and all other public accommodations, prohibited state and municipalities from denying access to public facilities on the ground of race, color, religion, or national origin, encouraged the segregation of public schools, and authorized the U.S. Attorney General to file suits enforcing the act. Expanded the Civil Rights Commission established by the Civil Rights Act of 1957, prevented discrimination by government agencies that received federal funds. Here are the 6 titles, and over the years there would be more. Title I, Voting Rights. Title II, Public Accommodations. Title III, Desegregation of Public Facilities. Title IV, Desegregation of Public Education. Title V, Commission on Civil Rights. Title VI, Non-Discrimination in Federally Assisted Programs. Martin Luther King won the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize for leading demonstrations, nonviolent demonstrations in the United States. Martin Luther King said, and Larry McCoy, my old boss at CBS, said his name is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That's what you need to refer him as. Said the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was nothing less than the second emancipation 101 years later. But there may have been the Civil Rights Act, but there was still rioting in the streets. Segregationists, angered by the Civil Rights Act, took to the streets as well, and they attacked African-American demonstrations across the South. These 3 guys were killed in one of those demonstrations across the South. Michael Schwerner, who came from Pelham, New York, and at Pelham High School there is a display of Michael Schwerner as a hero. Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, both white New Yorkers, traveled to the heavily segregated Mississippi in 1964 to help organize civil rights efforts on behalf of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. The third man, James Chaney, third man, James Chaney, was a local African-American man who joined CORE in 1963. On June 21st, they disappeared. Their bodies were found on August 4th. On June 21st, 2005, on the 41st anniversary of the 3 murders, 80-year-old Edgar Ray Killen was found guilty of 3 counts of manslaughter. That was in 2005. Decades of police brutality, kept off by several incidences in the summer of 1964, led to a series of racially motivated riots: Harlem, Philadelphia, Chicago, Jersey City. Meanwhile, the United States wasn't the only country going through this. South Africa, apartheid, white area only on this beach. That's it. You white, you could be on that beach. It came to a point in 1964 where South Africa was thrown out of the Olympic movement. Please boycott apartheid sport. And in 1964, the International Olympic Committee did something right. They usually don't do much right. They threw out South Africa on August 18th, 1964. They being South Africa, were barred from taking part in the 18th Olympic Games in Tokyo because the government refused to condemn apartheid. Vietnam, Gulf Tonkin Resolution. Johnson's a war criminal. No destruction in Vietnam. During the late 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower's administration, Eisenhower looked at Vietnam. I know my father once told me in 1954, he was drafted in 1953, that there was some talk that he might go to Vietnam because the French had left Vietnam and Vietnam had split into two countries, North Vietnam, communist, South Vietnam. They weren't communists, and it became a civil war. There was the Cold War going on too at that point between the Soviet Union and the United States, the Warsaw Bloc countries against the West. Cold War anxieties dictated that if North Vietnam and the communists prevailed, the rest of Southeast Asia would fall like dominoes. The domino theory. South Vietnam goes, and Kennedy talked about this in 1961, South Vietnam goes, the rest of them will go. And Kennedy took a vow. South Vietnam would never fall to communism as soon as he took office in 1961. And there is Robert McNamara, who is the Secretary of Defense, who had no business being the Secretary of Defense. He was an accountant with the Ford Motor Company. He didn't know anything about the military. He was a bean counter for Ford. But he was a whiz kid, and he was hired by Kennedy to be the Secretary of Defense. And he stayed on after Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson didn't get rid of him. On August 7th, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was prompted, or the Gulf Tonkin Resolution was passed on August 7th, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson, and was prompted by two separate attacks on two U.S. Navy destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, and that occurred on August 2nd and 4th of 1964. Well, were they attacks or were they not attacks? To this day, it has not been clearly answered. The two destroyers were stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin, the waters that separate Vietnam from the Chinese island of Hainan, and it caused a problem. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorized Lyndon Johnson to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression by the communist government of North Vietnam. August 7th, 1964 is the official date that the Vietnam War started, except there were people killed, military people killed in Vietnam in 1963. And Kennedy was kind of waffling about what to do with Vietnam in 1963. Ultimately, he didn't do very much. According to the U.S. Navy, the Maddox and Turner Joy reported being fired upon by North Vietnamese patrol boats, but there have been doubts about that second attack. The attacks would lead to the escalation of American involvement in the Vietnamese Civil War. And there is Johnson again. By January 1965, when I was 8 years old, 5,400 men were called for the draft. By December of 1965, more than 45,000 men were called. The monthly draft call rose from 17,000 to 35,000 a month. And by 1966, across the nation, young people began engaging in civil disobedience over the war and protesting the war. Now there is Nikita Khrushchev. I don't know where you get a hat like that. It's quite the hat. Leonard Brezhnev. Kind of looks like an old pilgrim hat in a way. Anyway, better times for Nikita and Leonid. Back in the USSR, October 15th, 1964, Nikita Khrushchev, who is the premier, who came in after Stalin is removed from office, and one of the reasons given, he was too friendly to the Americans. He was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. And there is Kennedy along with Khrushchev. They, of course, had their little spat in 1962. Actually, it wasn't a little spat, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where allegedly Soviet missiles were headed to Cuba that could hit the US East Coast without a problem. And there's Nikita with a very young Fidel Castro back in the day where Nikita was the Soviet premier. The Cuban Missile Crisis, that was 1962. Khrushchev deployed nuclear missiles in the newly communist Cuba, easily within striking distance of most metropolitan areas in the United States, big population areas, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, Baltimore, and certainly Florida, although Florida's population wasn't very big at that point, New Orleans as well, Houston. The United States was well aware that the missiles were still only partially developed. It really didn't pose an immediate threat. Cuba was, Khrushchev was forced to remove the missiles from Cuba. John Kennedy, in 1961, had authorized the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and he publicly consented not to attack Cuba. Kennedy also privately agreed to take American nuclear weapons out of Turkey. Nikita Khrushchev and Mao Zedong, they had a little Cold War themselves going on between then Peking and Moscow. Neither one of them liked each other. Starting around 1960, 11 years after Mao consolidated power in then Red China, Communist China. Stewie Gates, my 9th grade teacher, always banged that into us in 1969. It's Red China, Communist China. Anyway, the two countries, Red China or Communist China and the Soviet Union, started calling each other names. Khrushchev said Mao Zedong was a left revisionist who failed to comprehend modern warfare, and Mao criticized Khrushchev as a psalm-singing buffoon. That tells him. Who underestimated the nature of Western imperialism, a psalm-singing buffoon. It's quite the tag. Anyway, Khrushchev is gone and he's reduced to reading the newspaper in the street. The break with China and food shortages in the USSR eroded Khrushchev's legacy and legitimacy in the eyes of other high-ranking Soviet officials who were already bothered by what they saw was an erratic tendency to undercut their authority. And there on the cover of Life magazine, the man of the week, Leonid Brezhnev, takeover of the Kremlin. And he said the Soviet people see their international duty in the support of the just struggle of the peoples against imperialism, colonialism, and Africa's colonialism was falling apart by 1964, neo-colonialism, and for their social and national liberation, for peace, democracy, national independence, and socialism. And Brezhnev would swing his way to Vietnam very shortly. We are coming out for an end to the arms race, for general and complete disarmament, for relieving the peoples from the mounting burden of military expenditures. But the guy he would help would be this guy, Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnam, the leader of North Vietnam. Ho was revered in the communist world and the colonial world, or the people getting away from colonialism, and was disliked in the Western world. On November 17th, 1964, the Cold War heated up again. The Soviet Politburo decided to increase support to North Vietnam. This included aircraft, radar, artillery, air defense systems, small arms, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. In a sense, North Vietnam was fighting a proxy war for the Soviet Union, as you can see there. Now, on Lincoln's birthday, February 12, 1964, over on another part of the world, fighting between ethnic Turks and Greeks in the disputed island of Cyprus left at least 16 dead. And this started in 1963. In 1964, the UN sent 7,000 peacekeepers to force peace in Cyprus. Lyndon Johnson turned his attention to this on June 5th, 1964, and he wanted to head off any further inflammation of the Cyprus crisis, and he told Turkey, that's it, no rash military moves. And Turkey and Greece did back off eventually. By August 10th, 1964, the UN brokered yet another ceasefire in Cyprus and diffused, at that point, the crisis between the Greek and Turkish Cypriots, heading off the threat of an invasion by Turkey. But that wouldn't be the end of it. That conflict would continue for years and years and years. That's Nelson Mandela in 1964. On June 12th, 1964, Nelson Mandela received a life sentence for committing sabotage against South Africa's apartheid government, but he avoided a death sentence. The Beatles came to America on February 7th, 1964. Ironically enough, the Beatles' first national exposure, at least as far as Walter Cronkite was concerned, was supposed to be on November 22nd, 1963. In fact, there were clips that were shown that morning on the CBS News show of that morning, which Mike Wallace was the anchorman for. The Beatles on Ed Sullivan. February 9th, 1964, 73 million Americans gathered around the television to see the Beatles. That is a remarkable number. You're not going to get numbers like that except for a Super Bowl. And if you do the mathematics, they probably would get more viewers than the Super Bowl did on February 9th, 1964, because of the growth of the country. So the Beatles are on Ed Sullivan, and it was a really big shoe. There they are, ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles. Mitzi Gaynor was on that show too. And there's Ed, old stone face. He's all smiles here. Probably made some money. That would make Ed smile. With Ringo, George, John, and Paul. He would have them on for 3 consecutive weeks. That would be the 9th, 16th, and 23rd. And old Ed got to go down to Miami because it's where the Beatles, as a group, they were vacationing there, and Ed decided to do a show out of a hotel with the Beatles. That is my old buddy, Robert Lipsyte. Robert Lipsyte, former sports writer with the New York Times. Robert coined the term jockocracy, which Howard Cosell took as his own. Asked Bob about that one day. He said, well, let Howard have it. He'd take it anyway. Anyway, jockocracy, that was when too many jocks, athletes, got jobs undeserving because they were an athlete in broadcasting. Jockocracy, Robert Lipsyte. Anyway, Lipsyte's down in Florida. He's covering the Yankees for the New York Times, and he gets a call from his editor saying, hey, there's something going on in Angelo Dundee's gym with Clay and maybe the Beatles. Why don't you go down there and check it out? And he does. And Lipsyte is put into this room, and in this room are the 4 Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And there's a book, Lipsyte has a book out there. And in the book, he talks about being in the room. It's called Accidental Sports Writer. I think that's what it's called, or Accidental Writer. And I think it's Accidental Sports Writer. And he's in the room with John, Paul, George, and Ringo. He told me that Paul, George, and Ringo were good guys. John was a pain. He said that first John didn't want to be there because he didn't support losers, and in his mind, Clay was a loser. His man was Sonny Liston, and then they had to cool their heels for a half hour in this room with this New York Times reporter, Bob Lipsyte. And finally, they were let out of the room. Lipsyte called it Worlds Collide, February 18th. 1964, and this is why worlds collide. Lipsyte, the Beatles had been in America for all of 11 days at that point, and they had done 2 Sullivan shows, and they did a concert in Washington, D.C. But what if the Beatles were overnight wonders, and that was that? What if Clay loses to Liston? Then Lipsyte just wastes a day at Angelo Dundee's gym, the Fifth Street Gym in Miami. That's what it came down to. Instead, Lipsyte is locked into a room at what would be culturally an historic event. And there is Sonny Liston. John Lennon loved Sonny Liston. And of course, Clay was running around Florida taunting Liston, to show that he, quote unquote, wasn't scared of the baddest guy in the world at that point. and B, to drum up support for the fight. And finally, the door is open, the cameras are up, the red light's on, and these guys go into showbiz shtick. You got Ali with the glove, these guys falling over, you got Ringo crawling on his back. Clay's first words when he saw them were, "Who are those four sissies?" So these guys had nothing in common, but you would never know that watching the news conference. They were like old pros, but been together. Showbiz. And there is Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali in 1985. I did get a chance to do some interviews with him prior to that. By 1985, he was shot. I mean, literally, he couldn't put two words together. That's Madison Square Garden, May of 1985. And a couple of years earlier, somewhat better days, it's me with the microphone back because I'm asking the question of Cassius Clay. That's 1982, 83, where he could still come up with some answers. Dundee had the gym where Cassius Clay trained for his fight with Sonny Liston, the Fifth Street Gym in Miami Beach. And there is Angelo Dundee many years later at a different gym with my son. That's 1994, where Dundee told me his version of the story, the champ and the Beatles. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali is becoming a polarizing character because of his friendship with Malcolm X. And at this point, he joins the Nation of Islam as Malcolm X is being slid out the door. And Ali becomes Muhammad X Muhammad Ali and becomes a scary guy for the American public. He does beat Sonny Liston. On March the 6th, 1964, the Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad announced that the new heavyweight champion of the world would no longer be known as Cassius Clay. This Clay name has no meaning, Elijah Muhammad said in the radio address. Muhammad Ali is what I will give him as long as he believes in Allah and follows me. Ali didn't stay very long with the Nation of Islam, and of course Malcolm X was thrown out, and he would go to Hajj in Saudi Arabia and would come back a changed man and was assassinated in 1965. But people didn't recognize the name Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali never changed his name because in the 1960s, you didn't have to legally change your name. This was it. I'm Muhammad Ali. So he was Muhammad Ali. The New York Times editor, Abe Rosenthal, was emphatic about it being Cassius Clay until he changed his name in the court of law. Bob Lipsyte was never a fan of Abe Rosenthal. There were a lot of people who weren't fans of Abe Rosenthal, the executive editor of the New York Times. Lipsyte worked for him. Ali never changed his name legally, but 1960 laws, he wasn't required to do so, but he became Muhammad Ali. All the news that's fit to print, paper of record, New York Times, September 18th, 1970. When Muhammad Ali is making his comeback against Jerry Quarry in Jersey, the headline, "State will grant Clay ring license." 6 years later, Abe Rosenthal still was refusing to call Muhammad Ali Cassius Clay. The Beatles. Beatles played one show in Florida. That was it, one show in Florida, September 11, 1964. But they almost didn't play that one show in Florida. The Beatles' September 11th, 1964 date at the Jacksonville Gator Bowl might have been canceled. However, it wasn't. The Beatles decided to take a stand in the civil rights movement in the United States and said, after learning that their show would be racially segregated, they put out a statement through Brian Epstein, their manager, and they're hanging on, obviously. They're not an overnight sensation or one-hit wonder. This is September. They were in the United States in February, so this is going on 8 months now. They issued a statement through Brian Epstein: "We will not appear unless Negroes are allowed to sit anywhere." This was after the civil rights movement. The Gator Bowl officials decided, you know what? We want them. We'll let Negroes sit anywhere they want. Sonny Liston never disappeared from John Lennon's radar. Take a look at the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover, and take a look on the left side. On the left side, you see a guy, ring attire, Sonny Liston. John Lennon, each of the Beatles were told to put their heroes on the Sgt. Pepper cover. And Lennon also put Hitler on there, but Hitler never made the cut. Ringo didn't put anybody on there. Paul put Fred Astaire on there, among others. But look to the left, you see Sonny Liston. Lennon never forgot Sonny Liston. And there is the wax likeness of Sonny Liston that made it onto the album cover. As far as John Lennon and Muhammad Ali were concerned, well, Lennon changed his opinion, obviously. That's the 1977 Jimmy Carter inaugural dinners in Washington, D.C. And Lennon and Muhammad Ali are doing something together. In 1972, Lennon, the Beatles are gone by this point in his life. Well, they really never were, but they were working together. Wrote a song called I Am the Greatest, and he gave it to Ringo Starr. John, George, and Ringo played on that on Ringo's album. It's called I'm the Greatest. Lennon couldn't say I'm the greatest. He figured he gave it to Ringo, tongue in cheek. But the song was written with Muhammad Ali in mind. Cultures clashed. The worlds collided. John Lennon and Muhammad Ali, 1977. The new breed, as Dick Young might have called them. And of course, the World's Fair opened up. That's a picture a couple of years ago of the World's Fair after the Unisphere was restored. Peace through understanding. On 650 acres, there were pavilions, public spaces, and displays from exhibitors around the world. Countries, cities, corporations, and private groups set up shop to display their ideas and accomplishments to more than 50 million visitors. But Robert Moses thought they'd get 70 million visitors. This World's Fair was never sanctioned by the World's Fair people or the people who sanctioned World's Fair, but Moses decided it's a World's Fair. It was the first World's Fair that ever was a corporate World's Fair. You had Ford, obviously Disney was there, not the Disney that we know today, and GM and Firestone and US Steel, and I remember Sinclair Gasoline, and Sinclair Gasoline's making a comeback. I've seen it around. Not only that, I've seen some of the Sinclair gas stations with Dino the Dinosaur on it around this area. And there is the World's Fair opening day of the 1964 World's Fair. That street is still there. It goes from the Tennis Center right to the Unisphere. But the World's Fair, Robert Moses, this was one of his failures. Moses had a lot of successes and he had failures, like the Brooklyn Dodgers not being in Brooklyn in 1958. By the end of the first session, 1964, the fair was on the verge of bankruptcy, and organizers used 1965 advance sales to help pay off the first year. Despite the financial troubles, the fair just did manage to struggle through 1965, and there was a full run. Maybe if they checked that fence near the Grand Central, where the Grand Central is, Expressway, Parkway, where people used to climb the fence and go in for nothing, maybe that would have helped out. I know people who have told me they used to sneak in with regularity into the 1964 World's Fair as 15, 16, and 17-year-olds. That's one of the ruins of the fair, the old New York State Pavilion. People are trying to renovate it. Men in Black used it in the movie, but after 1965, it just sat there and decayed. This didn't decay, though. Walt Disney took this idea from the 1964 World's Fair. There were only one of them. There was only one of them. That was Abe Lincoln, electronic Abe Lincoln, talking to an audience in one of the pavilions. That would eventually become a Hall of Presidents, which Disney took to his theme parks. It's a Small World. That was created for the 1964-65 World's Fair. It was created by Walt Disney. It was in support of the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF. It was a major attraction. It was a hit for the 2 years at the fair. It was packed up and shipped to Disneyland in Anaheim, where it opened up May 28th, 1966. A lot of what you see at Disney World, which opened in 1971, Walt Disney did a lot of research and development based on what was going on in the World's Fair. The Anchorage earthquake, that was in March of 1964. I speak on cruise ships, or I used to speak on cruise ships. I don't know if I'm going to be doing that anymore because of COVID. And one of the things that you see on the train from Anchorage, Alaska to where you picked up the boat in Alaska was dead areas that were caused during the 1964 earthquake. When you got to where the ship was, which was about a 2-hour train trip from Anchorage. And that was Anchorage in 1964. It was one of the biggest earthquakes ever in the world. It was the Great Alaska Earthquake, 5:36 in the afternoon, Alaska Standard Time. And I do remember it because I never went to sleep, and I watched the news at night. And I remember watching that. So the Alaska earthquake. The Warren Commission came out in 1964. A lot of conspiracy theories still abound from the 1963 assassination of John F. Kennedy, but Lyndon Johnson wanted an official report. And among the people on there was a young lawyer from Philadelphia by the name of Arlen Specter. And this is a Jewish group, so I'll tell you a quick story about Arlen Specter. I worked on the John Madden radio show for a long, long time. A guy by the name of Gary Bridges was the producer of the show, and his wife, who was Jewish, had an uncle who happened to be the treasurer of the synagogue that Arlen Specter attended in Philadelphia. And the High Holy Days were coming around. And Arlen did not send his money to Uncle Harris. His name was Harris. And Uncle Harris called Arlen at his office in Washington. This is about 18 years, no, it's got to be longer than that, about 20 years ago. And he says, look, I don't care if you're a senator. I don't care if you're my senator from Pennsylvania. If you want to keep your High Holy Day seats, that money better come in now. It better come in now. I want it by tomorrow, or I'm giving your seats away. The senator in the United States in Washington, Arlen Specter from Philadelphia, made sure his local office in Philadelphia went to the synagogue and handed Harris a check so we could keep his High Holy Day seats where they had been for years, for the High Holy Days. But Harris gave him a mouthful, saying, I don't care if you're a senator or not, you're not going to get the High Holy Day tickets unless that money is in by tomorrow at 5 o'clock. You got the money in. Anyway, the Warren Commission does come out in September of 1964. The Warren Commission report, September 24th, is given to President Johnson. On September 27th, it's released to the public. The report concluded, the other guy was Gerald Ford and a whole bunch of other people who were on that committee. The report concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone with an unknown motive in assassinating John F. Kennedy, and Jack Rubenstein, the strip club owner, who happened to be, for some reason, in the Dallas police headquarters with a gun that Sunday morning, acted alone in the murder of the suspect, Oswald. People have doubted the report, and that has led to the rise of conspiracy theories, but those conspiracy theories, it's 57 years later, seem to now be vanishing as people get older and less people are alive now than obviously were alive back on November 22nd, 1963. There was a presidential election that year. It was Barry Goldwater, the Republican, against Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat. Johnson, who had assumed the office of the presidency November 22nd, 1963. Goldwater was critical of Johnson's liberal domestic agenda. He rallied against welfare programs, defended his own decision to vote against the Civil Rights Act, which was passed by Congress in July. Goldwater seemed to suggest that he would not be above using nuclear weapons on Cuba and North Vietnam to achieve whatever objectives Barry Goldwater had. And that led to maybe one of the most ruinous political commercials of all time, the daisy chain commercial, where the girl is pulling the daisy chain with nuclear destruction in her background. Johnson would defeat Goldwater, 60% of the popular vote. He wins his first full term in office after taking over and performing the duties of president for 11 months for John Kennedy. Martin Luther King did win the Nobel Peace Prize for his non-violent resistance to racial prejudice in the United States. He was 35 years old at the time, the youngest person to receive the award. Sidney Poitier would get an Oscar. April 13th, 1964, he became the first Black performer in a leading role to win an Academy Award for his performance in Lilies of the Field. Now, when I'm in person, I ask people, who is that woman? Because if you watch TV in the late 70s and early 80s, she was a big star on TV. But because I'm on Zoom, I won't do that. Us Territon smokers would rather fight than switch. That is Linda Gray. She played in Dallas, in the TV show Dallas. She was Larry Hagman's wife. I don't know her name because I never saw the show. I know his name, J.R. Ewing. Join the Unswitchables. Get the filter cigarette with the taste worth fighting for. But in 1964, well, it might have been the filter cigarette with the taste worth fighting for, but in 1964, the Surgeon General of the United States, Luther L. Terry, released the first report of the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee on Smoking and Health, and he basically said, smoking causes cancer and can harm your health. That was in 1964. Television ads were still on. They would continue for a whole bunch of years. Television ads in the United States are barred on radio and TV for cigarettes, but in print, you're allowed to have cigarette commercials. And we end up 1964 with That Was the Week That Was. I used to watch that show. It started when I was 7 years old. That's the TW3 girl. I can even sing this song. That was the week that was. It's over. Let it go. There are some shows still up on YouTube from the United States run, and there are a lot of shows from the British run. I love the show. David Frost was the host, both in the United States and Canada. Nancy Ames was the TW3 girl. Henry Morgan was on that show. Woody Allen, Steve Allen, Alan Sherman. Hello, mother. Hello, father. Here I am at Camp Granada. He was on the show. Buck Henry, who became Mel Brooks's partner on the Get Smart series and eventually would write for Saturday Night Live. Dick Knoll, Elliot Reed, the songs of Tom Lehrer. We still listen to the songs of Tom Lehrer. The Masochist Tango is one of my favorites. Pat Engelon, Phyllis Newman, Bob Dishy, Mort Saul. Mort Saul used to have a ticker tape machine inside of his house so he could read the news. He'd love the internet today. Jerry Damon announcing. That was the week that was. In the English part of the show, Graham Chapman and John Cleese, who would form Monty Python, were the writers. The British version of the show was much more wicked than the American version of the show, although the American version of the show was wicked. In fact, I was watching before I started writing this, whatever is left on YouTube of the show, of the American show. The BBC show received many complaints. Lord Aldington, the vice chairman of the Conservative Party, wrote to the BBC Director General Hugh Green that David Frost had a hatred of the prime minister, which he finds impossible to control. But the program also had something else. The program attracted complaints from the Boy Scout Association about an item questioning the sexuality of its founder, Lord Baden-Powell. Well, there are all kinds of lawsuits in the United States in 2020 about sexual discrimination and abuse in the Boy Scouts. That was on TW3 in England. Sometimes it's the satire shows, not the news shows, the satire shows that hit the bullseye. That was the week that was. It's over, let it go. Oh, what a week that was. That was the week that was. And that was the year that was, because you had women going to beauty parlors and coming out looking like that. Well, not every one of them, but those were some of the hairstyles in 1964. 1964 featured the start of the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles in the United States, Beatlemania, and Muhammad Ali. A civil war in Cyprus, a change in the USSR. The New York World's Fair opened. The first baby boomers turned 18. There were world-changing events. Some of those events are still impacting people in the year 2020. I want to thank Vicki for having me here, and hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to either put it in chat or unmute yourself. Rich, you saw Led Zeppelin in 1969. Right, that was 2 weeks after Woodstock at the World's Fair. So yeah, that's pretty cool that you saw Led Zeppelin, because nobody seemed to know who they were at that point. So you can unmute yourself if you want. Everybody.
Yeah, I remember that being a very small crowd. I mean, it was the size of a large ballroom up top there. And we were maybe 20 feet from these guys, and we sort of knew who they were. But the other thing I remember from that summer of '69 is the week before Woodstock. I know I'm digressing.
Yeah.
But there was a free Jefferson Airplane concert in Central Park the week before Woodstock. And opening for them was a band we knew nothing about. It was Santana.
Oh, Carlos Santana.
It was Santana with like 12 drummers on stage. I had never seen anything like it. But
he went to Woodstock.
Yeah. Well, Bill Graham told him, you come to Woodstock, you'll be a star. Their first album wasn't even out yet. But I figure sometime around '64, I saw Muddy Waters in the Village. And that changed my life. Because when the Stones and Beatles came out, you were either a Stones guy or a Beatles guy. I was a Stones guy because I had seen Muddy Waters.
Well, they were a blues band and the Beatles were a pop band.
That's it. That's it.
And that was the difference in,
I love them all.
in 2020. They're both still there.
Yeah.
I mean, McCartney's coming out with another album. And so at least I was reading today, Keith Richards was talking about yet another Rolling Stones album. And those guys are now approaching the age of 80, which is amazing. But B.B. King was still out there, right? He didn't stand up. He sat with his guitar and he played, but he was in his close to 90. And Tony Bennett, he's not performing right now, but Tony Bennett was performing well into his 90s. So anyway, anybody else? Well, I want to thank Vicki for inviting me. And I'm going to make this available on video to her so people can see it. I want to thank everybody for spending some time with me. I have a baseball talk tonight and in Monticello. So I'm keeping in the Borscht Belt area tonight. And tomorrow I have a talk tomorrow night in Illinois about how sports operate. So I want to thank everybody for attending and thank Vicki for inviting me. And we will we will chat again at some point in the near future. And thank everybody at the Riverdale Y for inviting me as well. And Vicki just hopped on. I just thank you, Vicki. And Vicki, I am sending you a copy of this video. So you will have it. So,
I just want to say hello.
okay.
And
You can have you can put this out on your website or send it to people.
yes, you told me that last time. There was a little bit of a glitch for people calling in today. I want to apologize, but I want to get all the names. I'm supposed to be very up to date with the attendance, so let me just make sure I get everybody's name. Diane Lane?
Yeah, yeah, but I want to get his name. I didn't catch it.
One second. Brenda Spooner?
Yeah.
Rich Friedman?
That's right. Yeah, the invitation went to my wife, Roberta, and she forwarded it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Who else was there?
I don't know. I wasn't keeping I wasn't.
Okay, I'm supposed to keep tabs on that. Very important.
Vicky, can you hear me?
Who's that?
Vicky, it's Hetty on the phone.
Oh, Hetty, you made it. Was there a problem?
Not at all. Hetty Rosen.
Hi,
Okay,
Hetty.
because I saw two people
Hi.
calling in, but I didn't see your number.
I'm here.
Oh, you were there throughout? Did you have a problem?
Yes.